You're listening to episode 104 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Jane Compson, Lynette Monteiro, and Frank Musten join us to speak about their new book, Practitioner's Guide to Ethics and Mindfulness-Based Interventions. One of the criticisms of mindfulness programs is that they don't include any kind of ethical component. This is usually followed up by casting aspersions about mindfulness just being a watered-down version of a particular tradition's approach to living, and often this is said by those who may not have taken a secular mindfulness program and certainly aren't experienced teachers of them. As a mindfulness teacher and someone with decades living and teaching within traditional contexts, I find this to be not just misleading, but flat out wrong. It is based on a presupposition that ethics, A, must be taught in a particular explicit way, and B, a specific set of ethics must be taught. I'm going to go out on a limb and call that what I think it is, a false equivalence. Ethics are deeply embedded in innovative ways using contemporary teaching methods shown to be more effective sometimes than traditional didactic methods. They may not be as recognized because they don't match preconceived notions about what they must look like in a different context. Jane Compson, PhD, is Assistant Professor in Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Her PhD is in comparative religion, and she has training in MBSR and Buddhist chaplaincy. She teaches in the topics of comparative religion and applied ethics, and is a member of a clinical ethics committee. Her research interests are in the application of contemplative practices, particularly those associated with Buddhist traditions, to contemporary contexts. She has published articles in the journals Contemporary Buddhism, Mindfulness, Journal of Nursing Education and Practice, and Interdisciplinary Environmental Review. Lynette Monteiro, PhD, is a clinical psychologist and director of training at the Ottawa Mindfulness Clinic. She is trained in CBT, cognitive processing therapy for veterans and active military personnel, several mindfulness-based interventions, and Buddhist chaplaincy. Her primary treatment interest is in developing the ethics-based mindfulness programs offered at the OMC. She also serves as a personnel selection psychologist for police and military units. As clinical professor at the University of Ottawa, she is in charge of training PhD clinical psychology candidates in an ethics-based mindfulness intervention. She is co-author of Mindfulness Starts Here, contributor to Buddhist Foundations of Mindfulness, and several articles and presentations on contemporary mindfulness, ethics, and treatment issues. Frank Musten, PhD, is a clinical psychologist and co-founder of the Ottawa Mindfulness Clinic. In private practice, he treats persons managing stress-related disorders and relationship issues. In the Ottawa Mindfulness Clinic, he has developed a burnout resilience program for executives, police, and military personnel, and conducted mindfulness programs with various military units. Working with military and police services since 1970, He has developed various programs for dealing with stress and currently is involved with clinical and pre-deployment assessment and post-deployment treatment of military members, including using mindfulness-informed treatments to manage PTSD. He also trains and supervises healthcare professionals in developing ethics-based mindfulness for clinical treatment. Our guests today are Jane Compson. Jane, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and Lynette, welcome to the podcast.
Wonderful to be here again.
And Frank, good to see you joining us as well.
Good to see you too.
So we also, for folks who are listening to the podcast, we're using Zoom right now. We do have one other guest. I'm wondering, Jane, if you might mention who that is.
Yeah, that's little Bish Bash, who is my little cat. He's pretty zen, except for when he's chasing birds. And he likes to be in the thick of things. So give him his judgment.
Thank you. So let's just dive right in and talk about this new book that you have. And it's, I think, extremely timely because of some of the pushback that we've seen from folks on mindfulness programs and the deplorable lack of ethics that are included in them. So let's start by asking, what prompted you to collaborate on this book? And I'm wondering, Lynette, if you might start us off on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I mean, yes, absolutely. It was certainly motivated by the growing discussion about ethics, both within the Buddhist community and the psychological mental health community. Initially, I had thought that our target article, the traditional contemporary mindfulness article, and the excellent responses that we got would have made a really nice sort of compendium. And when I, flew that past the editors, they came up with an additional idea of, why don't you just write a new book? Which, of course, we can all do at a drop of a hat. But that opened up the door to, of course, bringing my colleague in crime here, Jane, on board, and looking at what we could do in terms of not striking back, but as much as gathering evidence of what's already in the wind, what's already been developing over the years. So that was where it went, and they were very happy Springer was very happy with that idea.
Great. Frank, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I sort of keen in almost as a subject matter expert in two areas, which is essentially organizations. And so my contribution has been primarily talking about the ethics and sometimes lack thereof in introducing mindfulness into organizations, and also the probably misunderstanding of the ethics of introducing mindfulness into military organizations, particularly when it's in the service of well-being.
Thank you. And Jane, how about you? I'm curious what it was like for you opening up the email saying, hey, let's write a book. What was that like?
Yeah. I wasn't surprised because of my brilliant trailblazing friend Lynette. I was just very delighted to be invited. But those guys did the real trailblazing and most of the work. But I thought it was really interesting that, especially for Frank and Lynette, it was really grounded in your own clinical experience and their own clinical experience, really feeling through their own evolution from MBSR to their own programs, these issues about how to embody ethics in the program. So I was really interested in that. And from my perspective, I'm teaching Buddhism and philosophy in my academic institution, but I'm also doing mindfulness in my classroom just for the first 5 minutes or so, and was aware of this critique of the secular Buddhist divide, a secular religious divide. And that's been a kind of conundrum that I've been grappling with for a long time. So I was kind of excited to have the opportunity to explore that as part of this program.
So something else I want to explore, Lynette, that you had brought up prior to our starting the recording today is what some of the impetus has been, the historical framework of this arising. I'm wondering if you could say a bit about that.
Yeah, it emerged towards the end as we sort of collected all the chapters together, and I kind of felt gobsmacked when I got all the chapters together, because Jane took the front end of it, which was the philosophy and some of the more bioethics, application ethics from a philosophical perspective. And Frank took the back end of it, which was the business and the military. And I kind of had the programs, the actual programs that were out there that, the MB something. So when we brought it all together, it was just incredible to see that many of us had been developing for a good decade from a framework of moral psychology. And we've been coming at it from, which of course, the arc ends up landing in positive psychology, which is Ruth Bader's chapter. But it just kind of blew my mind that we'd all been working in our little corners of the world, but working from the same base. And this was something I've been trying to find for a really long time in terms of my own motivations and my own, I would say, an obsession to look for this ethical framework that should exist in mindfulness, not that would parallel the Buddhist teachings. And came right back full circle to my early undergraduate psychology days of moral psychology and Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan and all these people. So to actually see the current work, the evolution of Kohlberg's theories and Carol Gilligan's theories showing up in mindfulness practices was amazing, because I knew it was there. It had to be. There's no way that psychological work has evolved without some ethical theory behind it, some moral development theory behind it. So I was in seventh heaven at that point. I didn't care whether the editing went well. I just wanted this book out there. So I think, as I said earlier, this book is also a history of psychology and mindfulness, and traces its own roots back to moral psychology from way back. So, to me, that was a huge, wonderful finding. It takes it out of that whole debate of, is it Buddhist, should it be this, is it not? Is it, I think those are philosophical questions that are important to ask. But on the ground, what's the theoretical framework here in psychology to do this? And that's a more important question.
It's fascinating to hear you speak of this, that the arc of it went through an exploration of what is this? What's under the covers here, and finding that it landed in a place that some folks might be a little uncomfortable with. Others might think, well, of course, it landed there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that embeddedness aspect in a bit. But I wanted to ask Frank if you had anything to add about that. Is that, what's your perspective on this arising of how ethics are finding their way into these secular mindfulness programs?
I mean, I can speak generally about its embeddedness in organizations, which is becoming almost an epidemic. And I sort of hearken back to an article, of all places, The Economist, on bringing mindfulness into organizations. And they're kind of querying whether or not it was any different from a walk in the woods. And essentially saying, and the other thing is that it was a bit tragic from their perspective. The Economist is a relatively conservative magazine. Tragic from their perspective is that the kinds of ideas that the Buddha shared 2,500 years ago were not necessarily being embodied in those programs. So that was kind of my own personal awakening, and then beginning to look. And so what I wrote was essentially describing the two chapters, one about organizations and one about the military, and looking at kinds of the things that they were saying, which Shalani Bale, for instance, talking about organizations, was saying that the ultimate goal often is to increase productivity, and just having to understand that and finding a way to be ethical within that context. You walk a very fine line. What Sean Bayer said when he was looking at the idea of bringing mindfulness into the military was that you're stepping into an organization that is constantly, the Canadian military, and that's the one I'll speak about, that's constantly sorting out its own ethical space. In my own connection with military units generally, I've always seen them stepping up for others. And so that idea that there's an embedded ethic in the military that's probably not recognized was really important for me to be able to remember it and potentially connect to. At the same time, I probably shouldn't out myself, but I used to teach in business departments. And so when I'm talking about organizational psychology, you're always recognizing, at least historically, some of the best personnel processes, the ones that sponsored well-being in organizations, emanated from some of the larger organizations at that time. And the question is, where do they go? So those kinds of things made it very interesting to be part of the book because we would be addressing those issues.
Thank you. And Jane, how about you, just talking a little bit about, was it interesting for you noticing this arising of these questions about ethics in programs? Or was that something that for you had always been well, yeah, of course it's in there? What was that like?
Yeah, I did find it very interesting. Yes, and I also thought, well, yes, it's always been in there. But one of the things that really struck me was how this whole debate started to uncover so many assumptions that we make about, sometimes the assumption seems to be that only religious, whatever that means, groups have ethics or have a right to teach ethics or have an explicit ethics. And also there was some other assumptions that if you are secular and you teach ethics explicitly, then somehow you're crossing over into this territory of religion, which is somehow a transgression of some norms, but of what norms exactly, it was unclear. So one of the things that interested me was the kind of this morass of assumptions and confusion or uncertainty about boundaries. Some of these boundaries are really socially constructed, some of them are uninterrogated, and when that happens, but everybody assumes that they mean the same thing, you get a lot of these tensions. Right. So I guess I was really interested in issues about boundaries, what's the difference between a religion and a secular approach, and where on earth ethics fits into all of that. And I'm still grappling with those answers, but there's so many different versions of what that should be.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you bring that up, because the concept to me, when I hear the term, for example, we talk about boundaries and there's a sense of entitlement, it seems, to the word mindfulness. And it must mean exactly this from a particular context. And that's a perfectly valid meaning. And in secular programs, as we've seen in doing some exploration of this, there are many definitions of what mindfulness may be. And particularly when we look at it with the rigor of scientific specificity, components are that it gets really complex. And it's not that those are wrong or that there aren't definitions, it's they may vary from study to study. What I found interesting in this whole exploration is when I hear the term, for example, I used to participate on interfaith panel discussions. And a Christian member of that panel used the phrase Christian values. All seated next to someone from Judaism, next to a Hindu, next to a Buddhist, next to something else. And everyone else said, well, what do you mean by that? I said, well, compassion and love and things like that they describe, which exist in all of those traditions. And so we push back a bit on how is that explicitly your tradition's purview? How is it that you own compassion? And that gave them pause, because they hadn't thought about that before. And you see the same thing happening here with mindfulness, that I have always viewed mindfulness as a human capacity. And again, many definitions here, but no one really owns it any more than anyone owns breathing.
Yeah, my take's always been that it's to use an analogy of exercise, there's nobody owns the fact that humans can improve their stamina if they exercise, or they can improve their strength, etc. No one owns that fact. But there are different training programs that offer different kind of affordances and strengths to get you to that fitness. And I think that you can discuss about, well, which one's more helpful and which one's more suitable for each person. But nobody owns the capacities of athleticism, for example, if you see what I mean.
I do. And for folks who are listening to the episode, I do recommend going to the episode page, because I did link the paper where Jane, you and Lynette talk about that specific example, because it was so beautifully articulated in our interview about it. So I want to shift a little bit to this question of how ethics are embedded in some mindfulness programs, because I think there is an expectation that they must be taught in a particular way, explicitly listed, and they must be these specific ethics from a perhaps traditional context. So how are you seeing ethics embedded in some, granted, not necessarily all, but some mindfulness programs? Lynette, I'm wondering if we could start with you.
The book, when I wrote my summary chapter for the intro chapter for the section I was writing on, I was really stuck because I bought into this whole idea of, there is only one approach to ethics. And as I started teasing this out, I thought, wow, this is a lot more complicated. And I'm really sorry I decided to do this book, right? What came out was there are two different creatures that we call ethics when we talk about ethics and mindfulness. The first is ethics in mindfulness. So that's the traditional one that we've been talking about. How does it show up in the curriculum? How does it show up in training? How does it show up? How do we actually convey values, concepts, things like that? The second is ethics of mindfulness. Who should we teach? How do we teach? What sensitivities do we need to have? How do we maintain oversight at the end point of our programs? So, I may teach something in an organization, or Frank may teach something in an organization because that's his specialization, but how do we maintain oversight so that we don't end up with employers who say, great, you've been on disability, you've taken an 8-week mindfulness program, we expect you back at work tomorrow. How do we keep that from being mismanaged, right? So these are two very important delineations and variegations of ethics. There's ethics in mindfulness and there's ethics of mindfulness. I think those two get confounded when we talk about ethics because we get so hot under the collar about it, we forget it's not a simple. So for me, that then gave the book a real definition of, looking at with Candy Gunther Brown's chapter and Ruth Bayer's chapter, it gave it a sense of what's the philosophy behind this and how do we look at ethics in mindfulness. Then the programs kind of showed how they did it, how was it applied. And then towards the end, the last part of the section of the book looks at the ethics of mindfulness. Now, these threads run through all of these programs. But it was really nice to be able to kind of give a foreground, background kind of look at it. So to me, I think that's a huge contribution in the book is that it clarifies what we're really talking about and situates us. What am I talking about when I say ethics of mindfulness with respect to MBSR, with respect to MICBT, with respect to Tish Jennings' program in C-Care? What are we, in care rather, what are we talking about here? So I think that to me was a really important finding.
Yeah, that's a very important distinction because the criticisms that I see coming in fairly regularly seem to be of that second variety, the ethics of having mindfulness in a particular context versus what's actually being taught there. Although I do see it on both sides too. I think you're right. There is that confounding of both of them when maybe it's two different things.
Yeah, and I think the dialogue has also been, in terms of ethics of mindfulness, the dialogue has been more of how dare you?
Right.
What are your ethics? Why do you think you can do this? And I think that's a total red herring.
Yeah.
And there's no addressing it. There's no way to address that reasonably. It's kind of a why question. Any why question has no answer.
Frank, how about for you? How are you seeing this question of embedded ethics within the program versus the context of it, particularly as your work within business and the military? I'm sure this comes up for you quite a lot.
So I think Lynette's differentiation, ethics in mindfulness and ethics of mindfulness, both are apparent in issues in both those organizations. So, for instance, the ethics in mindfulness is that often when people are doing this who don't have a clinical background or don't really quite understand some of the potential adverse side effects, is that they offer programs without due diligence, without really recognizing, is this going to be harmful to the individual? The ethics of mindfulness really is based upon two things. One is bringing a program that's intended to relieve suffering into an organization that is competitive and often pushes people. And so there's a nuance there in that in any mindfulness program, people become more aware And they may even become more aware that this is not a place I can be. And so organizations don't quite expect that, but that also does happen. I mean, I have case examples that aren't particularly relevant here, but it happens quite frequently. Say, I really can't do this. And so, in some sense, you're being a bit subversive if the organization doesn't understand that the intent, and usually the practice itself, is going to be more conducive to fostering well-being, because awareness says this is my limit, than it is going to be in terms of getting some person to take a deep breath and do more. So there's a bit of a disconnect between what organizations expect and what they actually might receive. So that's the ethics of, and it's at 2 points. Am I benefiting the organization by doing it? Well, there's some sense that might be a problem if it causes damage. And is the organization actually receiving what what they expect to get? Because we're really training awareness.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that in a moment, the transparency aspect of it. But first, Jane, I want to ask you a bit about the ethics in mindfulness programs. And I wonder if you could speak for just a few moments about how is ethics, whatever that is, understanding that's a broad and vaguish term, how does that show up in some mindfulness programs that you have experience with?
It's a difficult question because it depends on how you're understanding ethics. But I guess the tradition I'm most experienced with, the approach, is MBSR. And I would say that sort of, and then John Kabat-Zinn talks about this, the ethics is kind of implicit in the sense that the whole program is designed to help manage your suffering, not your suffering only, but other people's suffering. So it's sort of underpinned by these values of compassion and care and warmth, etc., etc. So in a way, there's a faith that the process having a faith in the process, which exists independently of our kind of descriptions of it. So the idea is that, as Frank was just saying, with increased awareness and calming down, kind of compassionate discernment, ethical discernment, I suppose, begins to emerge spontaneously. But I also am sympathetic to developments like many of the ones discussed in the book, which say that there's something to be said for actually really making that implicit explicit. There's nothing to be ashamed of in making that explicit. The way we behave is a foundation for our mental comfort or discomfort. And we do know from experience that certain kinds of conduct are more conducive to calming down, slowing down, or feeling better, I suppose, than others. And really focusing on that as part of the training is going to be a force multiplier, if you like, for its effectiveness. And it's just really coming out about, mindfulness is also about ethics. So I get both sides of it. I get that people are worried about red flags start rising when organizations think that you're bringing in something that kind of sounds a bit religious-y. I understand that. And so therefore, not being too explicit about that stops raising those flags. But at the same time, I think, well, that's just there isn't such a thing as a value-free training program. Every training program has got values in it, and people just have to get over that idea that you can have one without them.
Yeah, what's interesting that comes up for me as you're describing this, that if one is okay with an explicit of values of ethics, then the question for me becomes, okay, which set? Whose?
Yeah.
Because there's going to be a great differentiation between what someone thinks should be in there and what others think about what should be in there.
Yeah.
This may vary from context to context.
Yeah, that's true. And there's also a difference between being really prescriptive about your values as well. I think that if you're trying to sort of say, well, this precludes you doing particular specific kinds of behavior, that probably is crossing a boundary of appropriateness, especially in a secular context. But making the general point that noticing with awareness how some of our conduct affects our minds and the kind of experiences of the day, and how suggestions about how certain kinds of contact can influence your mental peace, I think is legitimate. But it's like everything else that we've been talking about. It's a line that has to be carefully. It's a balancing act.
Lynette, I'm wondering if you might shift over to you as we go into this topic of transparency in mindfulness programs. And again, there may be some different varieties of transparency. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about that, because that's also something that you have in the book.
Yeah, I think that's a really important issue because it does come back to, it sort of bridges between the ethics in and ethics of, right? If I'm, and this also allows a certain freedom in terms of if I want to teach a mindfulness program that's very strongly rooted in Buddhist frameworks of ethics, then it's really important that people know this, right? So if I look at Bruno Cayun's program, Bruno is a longtime practitioner in the Goenka tradition, and he's very explicit about the fact that the ethics practice within his program, MICBT, comes very directly from, and he makes no bones about calling it exactly what it is, which are the 5 precepts. Right? I think in our program in MBSM, we tend to be just a little bit softer because we draw from Thich Nhat Hanh's interpretation, and it's more aligned with the ACT model where you're exploring your values and you're exploring the incongruence within it. Nevertheless, we do have to be very clear that we are drawing from a religious tradition. We're doing our best to offer it. And we make it very clear that if this is something that causes distress, and we have had, for example, people who are Orthodox in their own religious tradition who've said, I can't take this program if that's what you're going to do. And that's legitimate. We send them on to other people with whom they may feel comfortable. As an aside, as a side story, we had one situation where someone came in, they were an Orthodox trainee in an Orthodox religious tradition, and said, no problem, I think I can manage this. I've talked to my superiors, and they're all okay with what I do. And of course, as soon as we rang the bell, we used the little Tibetan Tingsa bells. And as soon as we rang the bell, there was this massive anxiety because we were using a religious object within the program. We'd never even thought about it because this was so subtle for us. We hadn't even examined that the very act of pulling up these bells and going clang was conveying a message of our affiliation. Now, I'm not a Tibetan practitioner. It didn't even occur to me that maybe even as a Zen practitioner, I ought not to be using these bells, right? But these are the subtleties that you suddenly realize, wow, I can try to be transparent, but then I get caught out because I don't even know the things that I'm not being transparent about. So this is a huge learning curve for all of us, I think, because we all walk into that room with our own set of values that have not been examined. So I don't know that there's a specific way. I don't think you can prescribe and say, you must say this, you must say that. I think we need to. But we also have to be open to the fact that we're going to uncover things we never questioned ourselves.
I think that's a very good point. Mm-hmm. I'm very careful when teaching, for example, an MBSR program that I ring bells, and the bells that I use are not the ones that are covered with Tibetan symbols, because that may be difficult for someone who's coming from a different background. And again, I'm not a Tibetan practitioner. That's not my background either. To me, it's just a bell. It's pretty, but that's my experience. Someone else's is more sensitive to that. And to make this a welcoming and safe environment for them, when I say transparently, I'm not teaching Buddhism. I'm not teaching any religion here, that I need to stick to that. And it may be very subtle how this shows up, but quite profound for some participants. So thank you for bringing that up, Lynette.
And I think transparency goes into many, many different levels. And at a clinical level, it also expands into some of what we are now discovering as the iatrogenic effects, the negative effects of meditation. And people, populations that are extremely vulnerable. I treated a number of military members for whom the words pushing your feet into the ground is a trigger. We learn by hard experience, but these are things where we need to be clear about the potential side effects of this. Can we deal with bypassing? Probably not, but we have to keep our clinical eye on that. And I think do the best we can with it. But there are certain things that we do have to be very clear about this treatment, just as we do with any traditional psychotherapy. If I'm doing counseling with someone who's having difficulty in their marriage, and I do individual work, not couples work, I have to be clear that, this may end up with your marriage ending. This may end up with your relationship needing to be brought into a zone that you may not be ready for. I think these are very legitimate things that as clinicians, we are trained to be honest about. And I don't think it's any different if we're doing mindfulness work.
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, it's one of the things that there are reasons why we have questionnaires for people before they take a program, is making sure this is the right time for them, that they will not be harmed as best as we can. They may be challenged. It's okay, but not harmed by what we're doing. And I'm wondering if we can stay with this topic for a little bit, just about some of the limits and risks in mindfulness programs. So wanting to make clear here in this discussion for folks listening is the view of this group that mindfulness programs are cure-alls intended to solve any problem. I don't think so. Lynette, why don't you follow up on that?
Well, it's fixed me.
Say more about that, would you?
I live in a delusional mind. That's fine. Yeah, I think there is a sense, and I'm hoping Frank will step in and talk about his own experience with organizations. With there is this rose-colored view, and it's really difficult when people suddenly realize that the relaxation is a side effect. The calming is a side effect. And in fact, there was a research article, and it's not been replicated anywhere that I know of, that showed a very clear progression where symptoms got significantly worse before they got better. And I have to dig that one up because I love that article. But it's really by class 2, class 3, people are coming in really angry because what is this? You told me I was going to feel good. Well, I never told you that. You inferred that. But they come in angry that things are not getting better. And it's, the metaphor I use, which I learned from somewhere, was it's kind of like you've been walking along the sidewalk, never really noticing the traffic. And now you're at the stoplight, and suddenly there's all this traffic. The traffic's always been there.
Right. You are now taking a look. You've been practicing becoming more aware.
You're now not jaywalking anymore, right? So I think that's a really important point to make to people. And in our info sessions, and we do group info sessions, and to get informed consent. And that's really what informed consent means is, do they know the whole landscape of what they're walking into? We make it really clear. There may be more important things you need to deal with right now, like addiction, like, being in an abusive relationship, like legal issues that you're dealing with, like disability issues with your employer. Those may be far more important right now than mindfulness, because mindfulness won't have traction when there's that level of agitation in your life.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting how consistent it is that around the same time you're also sharing, sessions 2, 3 is when folks start to really open up to and notice what's going on. And there can be some agitation along with that. So Frank, how about you? What about your thoughts on the difficulties and the challenges that people run into and our transparency about that?
Sort of following from what Lynette said, particularly in organizations, because often it's really just something people take. We offer some multi-week programs in some organizations that people come in thinking that what's going to happen is that everything is going to be really nice. It's going to allow us to feel very good. And there's been no expectation that this is a relatively difficult practice to actually acquire, can cause people to have a lot of distress, and may not be for you. So it's not universal. And so we take we take a lot of care, first of all, to give some examples of the distress you might feel, very short, brief versions of it, so people get a sense that, oh, that's what it is. Yes. We also indicate and we normalize the difficulty and allow people to begin to see that as being able to be with that so they can make better choices. And so it's set that way. But the main thing is that we try to develop a way of collecting data so the organization understands what they bought and why it's something that's useful to them. So essentially, we're fostering well-being, but also letting the organization know well-being is something that they really should connect to. And so far, I mean, the organizations we work for have been very happy with that. Some other people put it in nice little forms so they can carry it around and say, here's what we do. The difficulty is that most programs offered in organizations don't do that because often they don't have the clinical background that says this is necessary. So they do things like, we want you to meditate for 30 minutes when some people are going to spin out after 5 minutes. And so that has to be acknowledged. When you carry it into the military, personally, I think there's been a huge misconception about the power of mindfulness in an organization that spends a lot of time getting people to be very focused on what they're doing and being able to manage to be more or less confident in the presence of horrific stress. I don't really think an 8-week program is going to change that. I really contribute to it. What we do is we offer it as a well-being program for people in pain for a variety of different reasons, not necessarily PTSD, burnout, high pressure, beginning to connect with the way of being with themselves that's healthier in the presence of that. So what we do very quickly is we teach people they have limits because military people have been taught we don't have limits. So you get them to connect to their limits so that they can live healthy within those limits when it's possible. In other words, they have regenerative time. And it really begins to focus around the actual people you're dealing with. The Buddha said, speak to your audience. And really, this is the ultimate sense of doing it, is that you're speaking to an audience that knows how to manage their breath, comes back to it frequently for a variety of different skills. You're not teaching them anything new, but they don't know how to stay with their experience over an extended period of time. So what you're doing in these programs is teaching them gently and slowly to be comfortable with their experience so they can manage being with it differently, so they're not as reactive.
Frank, I actually want to stick with you for a moment while we're talking about mindfulness programs in a military context, for example. One of the criticisms we often hear is mindfulness programs will just create mindful snipers focused on the attentional aspect of it, and that this wonderful religious teaching is being co-opted for nefarious purposes. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that for just a few minutes.
My experience is entirely with the Canadian Armed Forces, and so I won't attempt to say that I can speak globally. But I also know that the individuals that I met in the forces are already extremely focused, and I don't think mindfulness trainings is going to increase that ability if you're looking at the attentional aspects only. I mean, they spent years and months perfecting that ability to stay focused under pressure. And I certainly wouldn't tell anyone who has to focus their attention and been trained that I'm going to teach them mindfulness so they can do it better. They would probably laugh. So in that sense, I think you're assuming too much from an 8-week program that really ultimately is a vexatious argument. You're not going to teach them anything they don't already know and know much better. What they don't know is how to let go of that and to be open and not as focused, but being able to take in things when they're not under threat. To be able to connect with walking in with the family, taking a breath, and seeing everything that's there, as opposed to looking for the thing that's going wrong. So what you're changing is that ability to broaden the focus across a variety of things that are over and above the idea of threat. They're focused on threat. They're not focused on the things that aren't. So that's the first skill you teach.
I wonder how that is in some way viewed as a violation of an ethical standard, because I fail to see how helping people manage their scope of awareness, their attention, where they're placing that, as being bad, giving them an opportunity to not be always in the looking for threat mode, how that's an ethically bad thing to allow them to, as you characterized it, be with their family or with themselves.
Ted, if I could jump in as well, is that Frank and I have interviewed a number of people who are highly trained snipers in the military for various things that we do. I want to really again make a differentiation between someone who has a rifle, kind of like the Kent State thing, where someone's got a rifle and they're up in a tower and they take shots at people. That person has sustained attention. They have capacities. What they don't have is a connection to a community and to a world in which their actions, the consequence of their actions make a difference to them. You can't train, nothing we do is going to train somebody to go and do that. As we saw with the massacre in Norway, I think it was in Norway with the children's camp, there's nothing we can do that's going to change that pathology. And this is one of the limits of mindfulness. Any mindfulness program that doesn't account for inherent pathology is asking for trouble, because then it becomes the practices become weaponized. So we have to take that and say, okay, there's something here that we need to be more careful about, and we need to take a deeper look at in terms of how are we actually selecting people for whom can come into these programs, and how is that going? That comes into that issue of oversight I talked about earlier. It gets, there's the issue of the sniper, the implicit adjective in front of that is military or police. And I want to address that very directly, which says a sniper going through the military, a sniper going through police, not only gets training in weaponry, they also get significant training in ethics and in decision-making, ethical decision-making, that sometimes calls on them to say no to a specific command. So they're not just sitting around waiting for some bad guy to come along so they can pick them off. It's part of a much larger set of decisions that are being made. And often the trauma, the moral injury that occurs for snipers is that they say no and then they have to pay for it. Or they say no and that's overridden and they're forced to do something. So this is much more the issue where if we are teaching mindfulness to military members, we're teaching them that sometimes you are going to have to make a decision to say no because it goes against all of your training, all of the ethics that you embody personally, and all of the ethics that you're told to embody as a military or police member. Some people can take that stance. Some people can't. It's no different from the population. I think that's a very crucial nuance to look at this issue of, are we training mindful snipers? If you're talking about attention, not really. You and I cannot train what the military does and the police do on their own, and we've watched those trainings. We can't do it. Trust me, there is no one I know who can actually go out there and train a sniper. It's just not possible because we don't have that training. So what we can train, however, is the capacity to hold what's being asked of them and to make the best decision possible, which may include having them lose their job, be court-martialed, or whatever else, and they're willing to take that stand. That's what we can support and help them become clear about in their job. And I think that's a really important issue here, because this whole issue of can you train a mindful sniper is, again, another red herring. It's a reactive statement that doesn't understand the nuances of what we're talking about.
Well, and displays a willful ignorance of the full context of all of it, who the people are, what the training they're receiving, what is the intention here.
I will guarantee you that if any of the critics have their child being held hostage, they will be very welcoming of a police sniper who's very well trained and has, can set aside the moral conscience of taking a life.
So I'm wondering if we can now shift to just what are some some last thoughts that you'd like to share with the listeners today on this topic of ethics in mindfulness-based programs or interventions? Jane, I'm wondering if we can start with you. And as I see you calmly petting your cat, if you could join us and just share some final thoughts that you have with the listeners.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on that really fascinating discussion you were just having with Lynette and Frank. I think that's so important. So I guess that's one of the things that I think generally the issue of transparency is something that is so live and crucial, and a theme that we're just beginning to tap into. I'm working right now on a paper on adverse meditation experiences, and I think that they've been given probably not enough coverage, and the risks that people might be taking on are maybe not known even by the teachers a lot of the time. So I think that's something we need to take seriously. I think generally now we're living in this kind of multicultural, postmodern, cosmopolitan society. We're always going to be having these discussions about boundaries and silos between who owns what and where different practices are appropriate. And I think that that's something we have to really embrace, and there's no avoiding the engagement about those questions. So even when I'm teaching my students, when I'm doing mindfulness in class, I bring that question of, well, some people find this practice, have questions about this practice because they think it might be religious, and we have a discussion about it in class. It becomes kind of a teachable moment. And then, I'm in an academic institution, so it's easier for me to do that than another context. But I think that really respects their autonomy, is that let's all work on this problem together. It's kind of like Frank and Lynette were saying in their piece. We're not the holders of the truth, those of us who are teaching mindfulness, but we are co-inquirers. And I think that kind of model of sensitivity to context, openness to lots of different voices, a willingness to get into the messiness of it all is really important, and will serve us much better than immediate, in-principled shutting down because of assumed or unquestioned boundaries.
Frank, how about you? What would you like to share as some parting thoughts for the listeners?
I think that the ability for us to step into places where pain really exists, the military organizations, and to offer something that is sustainable, that will foster well-being, and people are often really, really under considerable stress, which is not going to change. Their ability to be different with themselves can. And I think that's the offer of mindfulness.
Thank you, Frank. And Lynette, how about you? What parting thoughts do you have for the listeners on this?
Well, I think, first of all, tremendous gratitude that we've been able to hold this together. And I just want to publicly say Jane has been my trainer in writing well and writing better. And Frank has been incredibly supportive of all my impulsive decisions to make things happen. The book, I think, for me is and what we've covered in it, I hope, is carried forward more from the perspective, as much from educating people about how mindfulness can be incorporated, how ethics can be incorporated in mindfulness programs. But the part that we never got to touch on is that the landing point of this moral arc is compassion. And the chapters in there on compassion, with compassion as the highest ethic, that was supposed to be the title of a particular section, but it ended up being the title of James Doty, James Covey, and Stan Steinel's chapter. And I think that, to me, really should be the subtitle of almost every book in mindfulness that we write. Mm-hmm. Compassion is the highest ethic. And, if we've been able to convey that in everything that we've done and we continue to do, I think I can happily say that I'm ready for, the seventh heaven, wherever that may end up being. Hopefully in a library with free access to publications.
And Wi-Fi.
And Wi-Fi, yes. Thanks so much, Ted.
Well, our guest today, Jane Compson. Jane, thanks for being here.
Thanks. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Frank Musten. Frank, thank you for joining us.
It's been really a lot of fun.
And Lynette Monteiro. Lynette, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.